Probably the key component in maintaining compliant access delivery is managing the lifecycle of your identities. Identity lifecycle management, also known as the joiner, mover, and leaver process, is the automation, typically from an HR system, for an employee or person to join an organization and to receive their initial access, or birthright access as it's often called, to detect the mover event for a person, which is when a person changes managers, departments, or job titles, and then the leaver event for a person when they no longer have a relationship with the organization and their access must be deprovisioned or terminated gracefully. EmpowerID's identity warehouse was designed specifically for the identity lifecycle, or the joiner, mover, and leaver processes. The design of the identity warehouse is that EmpowerID will inventory in all of the data from your systems that you're monitoring. So your HR systems, your AWS, your Azure, your ServiceNow, your Salesforce, your SAP, your RACF mainframe, your LDAP systems. It pulls this data into the data warehouse, and this data can be analyzed and managed. User accounts are pulled into the account table, and we know in the system which systems those user accounts are coming from. At this point, all the user accounts are what are considered orphans, meaning there are no person objects in the system, and these person objects do not exist and are not linked as the owners of the user accounts. Now, EmpowerID is a full-featured identity administration platform, so these user accounts can be managed. Orphan accounts can be created, added to application roles or groups, have their passwords reset, and deleted. But a key process for joiner, mover, leaver, or the management of the identity lifecycle of humans, is that linking these user accounts to a person object that represents the owner or the human being or the object or thing or bot that owns these technical accounts. So for this process, these user accounts are linked in a person object is created. Now, once the accounts are linked to a person object, that anchors them together for reporting and for management throughout the lifecycle. It also anchors them together for attribute flow rules to determine when an attribute changes in one system, such as telephone in the telephone system, what are the rules for which other systems should receive this attribute update, and flowing this data back and forth. It also links them together for the purposes of single sign-on, so that a person, a human being, can log in once with multi-factor authentication to a trusted system, and then seamlessly authenticate into any of the other systems for which they have a user account. Because EmpowerID's Identity Warehouse knows that they do have a user account in that system, and it knows for that system how single sign-on can be achieved, typically by an open standard such as SAML or OpenID Connect. So one of the keys to identity lifecycle management is being able to connect to as many systems as possible. Connecting to a larger number of systems increases the value and the reach of your joiner, mover, leaver identity management processes. EmpowerID includes a huge number of out-of-the-box connectors for a wide range of systems. These connectors you can simply run through a workflow wizard, enter in the connection information, and EmpowerID will begin to inventory and to monitor them, and once the settings are enabled, to manage the identity information in these systems. The connectors from EmpowerID are typically much, much deeper and more powerful than other identity management connectors. As an example of that, our SAP ABAP landscape connectors go down to the T code or transaction code level. So EmpowerID will pull in the SAP users, the SAP roles, both single and composite, the SAP profiles, both single and composite, the T codes, and EmpowerID knows at each level, single role, single profile, composite profile, which T codes are granted by each, and the inheritance. So even if roles and profiles are nested and a user receives one of these composite roles, the system knows all of the resulting T codes that user may execute in the SAP systems. This provides detailed information for auditing, logging, reporting, and especially for risk management policies. EmpowerID also, as it's connecting to these systems, discovers any new objects that are created, attribute modifications, and most importantly, role and profile changes or group membership changes. So group membership or role changes are detected on every inventory, which is typically every 10 minutes, and these are audited and logged to determine was the change related to a request or a policy in EmpowerID, or was this a change outside of the control of EmpowerID, which could trigger a risk-based micro recertification at that time to certify the change or to roll it back. Also, email alerting can happen to responsible individuals for these roles. Another example of the deep connectivity is EmpowerID's connectors for Windows local servers. For Windows local servers, EmpowerID not only inventories and manages the local Windows users and groups on those servers, it also goes a bit deeper. It inventories the Windows services. You can manage them, if they're running or they're stopped. They can be stopped and started. And most importantly, it inventories the identities that are set as the service identities. So EmpowerID can report on which services are running as which identities. And if you have EmpowerID's privileged access management, these identities can be maintained, their passwords can be rotated, and they can be recycled. EmpowerID also does the same for IIS application pools and their identities on Windows servers that have IIS installed. As part of EmpowerID's innovative approach to identity and access management, EmpowerID has fully embraced both microservices and SCIM. SCIM, or Simple Cloud Identity Management, is an open standard that vendors have agreed to for exchanging identity information between identity management systems and applications. Any application that exposes itself via SCIM can be connected and managed by any system that supports connecting and managing SCIM-compliant systems. This is designed to take the guesswork out of connecting to a large range of applications and also to reduce the repetitive coding of custom connectors. Now, many systems do not support SCIM yet, and EmpowerID has come up with an innovative solution to make these systems SCIM compliant and therefore able to be accessed by any SCIM supporting system and to participate in a more flexible landscape. EmpowerID has developed what is known as the SCIM Server Microservice Connector Framework. Basically, it is a microservice template offered by EmpowerID, so it can run as a Docker container or a very lightweight microservice to be hosted anywhere. And it handles all of the complicated and heavy lifting of exposing a fully SCIM 2.0 compliant server or microservice to expose the APIs for users and groups. Now, the other side of the equation is that the SCIM microservice needs to connect to your on-premise systems or cloud systems that do not support SCIM. So it supports a plugin model where very simple connectors can be developed in .NET Core code and dropped into the SCIM microservice. So the connector code does not need to have any knowledge or relation to EmpowerID. It's simply the code that, for your specific system of how to retrieve users, retrieve groups, retrieve group memberships, create, delete, reset passwords for users, create groups, delete groups, and to add or remove users from groups. So for a database system, these would be simple ODBC database calls. For LDAP systems, simple LDAP calls. So developing a plugin for the SCIM microservice framework does not require any knowledge of EmpowerID to develop this plugin. Once the plugin is dropped into the SCIM microservice, there's no knowledge of SCIM required either. That is handled all for you. So your application immediately becomes a full-featured SCIM 2.0 compliant microservice. Now, on the EmpowerID side, EmpowerID has a rich and configurable SCIM 2.0 connector. So EmpowerID, without any modifications or coding, can connect to any SCIM microservice developed in our framework or any system that supports SCIM, easily extending EmpowerID to many, many systems without the need for custom connectors. In this example, you can see a SCIM microservice connector for Azure AD. So it transforms the Azure AD schema for users into the SCIM version 2 user schema. That way, any system connecting to this microservice already knows what to expect from the schema perspective, what actions are available, and which data would be available. EmpowerID took this unique technology and also extended it for the world's first SCIM virtual directory. Basically, the SCIM virtual directory is a SCIM-compliant microservice where the connector plugin is for EmpowerID itself. Now, EmpowerID is an identity warehouse, which means that EmpowerID has person objects and roles that are unique to the EmpowerID system. These, of course, are exposed as SCIM-compliant users and groups. But in addition, the virtual directory side, EmpowerID is connected to all of your systems via standard connectors, Active Directory, RACF, SAP, and other connectors. So the SCIM microservice also exposes these systems, the users and groups in these downstream systems, as SCIM compliant, basically exposing your entire environment as one large SCIM microservice for any other system to consume the data or to interact with, to provision, deprovision, or to assign and revoke entitlements. So how does the process for identity lifecycle start out? Well, once the data for the user accounts from HR and all your systems is inventoried into the account table, as I mentioned, they're all in there as what are called orphans. Orphans meaning they're just user accounts that could be managed, but that we have not yet identified which of these user accounts belong to human beings. Now, the view of these user accounts is called the account inbox, which allows you to see these accounts, to see which are orphans, and to analyze which have been processed by the identity lifecycle rules. In this view, we're looking at user accounts coming from our HCM system and discovered from that system between a range of time. And we can analyze which of them are still orphans or which have been processed already through the rules and what was the result. And the result can be that they could be either joined to an existing person object, meaning that we already have a person object for this person, and this is an additional user account owned by that person that's joined to that person. Or the result could be a provision, which means that this is the first user account for that person and triggered the creation of the person object based upon the attributes and data in this user account, and then the account was linked to the person. The join and provision rules that determine which user accounts should be analyzed, because many could be excluded if they're never going to potentially be joined or provisioned. Just ignore those. And then which accounts can be joined to a person and the criteria for a join. Those are all configurable. There are many default options like joining by birth date, first name, last name, by employee ID, first name, last name. Those are easy to configure. And then for organization-specific rules, a SQL query can be written based upon any data in the identity warehouse. This gives you complete flexibility to join user accounts automatically based upon any type of matching criteria that makes sense for your organization. So these join rules are evaluated for any orphan user accounts in the system or in the account inbox to try to automatically join these accounts to person objects. Now, if the join rule does not match, then potentially those user accounts are a provision or represent a new person. The provision rule is where it determines, is this user account a new person representing a joiner or an onboarding event? Typically, those rules only allow provisioning from certain systems like HR and only where certain criteria are met, such as having a first name, a last name, an employee ID, and a valid contract date. That this isn't a contract from the past, but the valid from and the valid until dates for this contract mean that this is a current active employee. Now, what is grabbing these user accounts from this account inbox table and evaluating them through the join rule and the provision rule to perform the join and provision actions? It's actually a special type of workflow called a permanent workflow, and it's the account inbox permanent workflow. The permanent workflow is a workflow that runs in a loop like a job, checking for objects that match its criteria and then performing actions against them, such as grabbing users where their passwords are about to expire and sending password expiration notifications. That's an example of a permanent workflow. In the account inbox permanent workflow, it grabs user accounts that are configured in your claim rule, the ones that you care about that you don't want to ignore. It evaluates them through the join rule to see if it can join those accounts, and if it can, it joins them to the person objects that already exist. It synchronizes the attributes to the person, and if it cannot join an account, it evaluates your provisioning rule to see if it should provision a new person and set the primary org role org zone, which is the primary business role and location from the data on this HR account, and then trigger any additional account provisioning or birthright access that this person should have. So the account inbox is responsible for processing your user accounts through your join rule and provision rule to determine if this is an account for an existing person to be joined, or if this represents a valid new onboarded person or with a valid contract date, or neither, where it should just be flagged to be ignored because it might be an older record from a person that existed or worked at the organization in the past. Now, the mover process is when an employee or person changes their status. Either their manager changes, their department changes, or their job function or title changes. EmpowerID has very powerful rules to detect these mover events, because on a mover, the person is changing what they do in the organization, so their access should be readjusted. For their new role, they'll need additional access provisioned so they can be productive day one. But also from a security perspective, they no longer need the same access they had previously, so that access should be deprovisioned or disabled to maintain security and to prevent entitlement creep. So how does EmpowerID detect the mover event? There are many flexible rules, but the typical process is through what's called RBAC mapping. So in the EmpowerID data model, EmpowerID inventories user accounts from external systems like your HR system, and it also inventories what are known as external org roles or external business roles. These are often represented by HR job titles or positions. It also inventories external org zones, organizational zones, which represent typically OUs or departments or cost centers from the external system. So org roles are typically job positions coming from HR, and org zones are typically department codes, cost center codes, or location codes coming from HR. So EmpowerID knows for each user account its current external role or job position and its external org zone or location. So it can detect when these change, when a person changes job title or when they change department, cost center, or location. So it automatically has this data available in the account to external org role and org zone mapping table. That is always the current external system role and location for the account. Now, this data is processed by the reevaluation process, or it's called the business role and location reevaluation inbox or processor, which processes these changes to determine what should happen. Now, the out-of-the-box rules are that these external org roles are mapped to EmpowerID org roles or EmpowerID business roles through this org role to external org role mapping. So you can map a business role in EmpowerID to one or more external job codes or positions coming from HR. So it knows that these external job codes are the equivalent of this EmpowerID business role. The same happens in the location side. An EmpowerID location can be mapped to one or more HR location codes, cost centers, divisions, Active Directory OUs, LDAP OUs. That way, the system knows that if a user is in a specific location in the external system, that their equivalent location should be this location in EmpowerID, and also the user's external role in that system or job code is the equivalent of this business role in EmpowerID. So the business role and location recompiler will recompile what should be the change. They should be transitioned or moved from this role and this location in EmpowerID to this new role and this new location in EmpowerID based upon changes driven from HR or another authoritative system. This is a view of the recompiler inbox. So you can see EmpowerID has the external business roles inventoried at all times. It has the external locations from HR or other systems inventoried at all times, and the association of user accounts in HR or external systems to these external roles and locations. Now, the business role and location recompiler simply reevaluates these changes using those mappings of the external roles and locations to EmpowerID's business role and locations, and it proposes changes that the users should change their primary or secondary roles from a current primary role to a destination role and destination location. Now, these proposals can be viewed and approved in the queue, and then another job will actually process them to make the changes happen. These changes in primary role and location or secondary role and location in EmpowerID will trigger a reevaluation of the policies for what the person should have that they do not have yet. Now, EmpowerID knows what they have currently based on inventory, so it knows which user accounts or entitlements they're missing, and that can trigger provisioning. It also knows based upon inventory the entitlements or user accounts that they have that based upon their new role and location, they're no longer entitled to have, and that can trigger the deprovisioning process. Now, the last phase in the identity lifecycle, or joiner, mover, leaver, is the leaver. Now, EmpowerID supports an unplanned leaver, which is simply a workflow where a person can be selected, and their termination or deactivation can be triggered manually. This workflow can go for approval, but typically it can only be accessed by authorized individuals. So it'll initiate an immediate termination of their person object and their associated user accounts and entitlements. Now, the planned leaver is typically driven by the valid from and valid until coming from HR. The valid from and valid until represent the contract validity for this person and their relationship to the organization. So EmpowerID has another permanent workflow called the submit person terminations, which is continuously looking for people whose valid untils are approaching expiration or have expired. This is configurable, of course. Now, the person valid from and valid until is updated based upon flow rules, so you can determine which system is authoritative for this information. Typically, again, it comes from HR. So the submit person terminations workflow will find the people whose valid until has expired or is expiring, and it will perform a first series of actions, typically disabling the person, disabling their user accounts, and preventing them from having access. Now, it will wait at that point for a specified number of days determined in your planned leaver grace period settings. These are settings that are in the identity lifecycle section and can be configured. Now, the grace period is how many days after this initial disable should it wait before initiating the second part of the process, which is the actual termination itself. So let's say that our grace period is expired. The second part of the process is to initiate or to send this person into what's called the terminate person advanced workflow. This workflow is customizable by any customer and configurable to determine what should happen to get this user out of the system in an orderly process, retaining access for long enough or transferring access to the appropriate people. Now, the initiator for this workflow can be selected, and the initiator of the workflow will determine whether or not the actions in the workflow should go for approval. So if you pick a user that has no access, of course, then this termination will always go for approval. This is a view of the terminate person advanced workflow. It typically starts off by terminating the person, which initiates the deprovisioning of the person object, and EmpowerID maintains these records, so they're simply flagged as deleted. It then checks if the person has a manager, and if the person is set as the responsible person or responsible party for any entitlements, such as privileged user accounts, technical accounts, group memberships, applications, anything that could have a responsible owner assigned to it. It checks if this person is set as the owner, and if so, it can automatically assign ownership of these resources or entitlements to their owner, or allow the owner to select the new person's replacement or to select the old person's replacement and transfer ownership of these resources to the new person who is taking over the terminated person's responsibilities. This ensures that objects are not owned by someone who has left the company, representing a security risk. And the last step typically is deprovisioning the entitlements based upon your settings as to how they should be deprovisioned, either automatically disabling and moving them to a different OU or deleting or deactivating these objects.